Hello and welcome to the 2024 MIFF Schools program. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all live, learn and work, and to pay respects to their elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. On behalf of MIFF, we believe in celebrating the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with MIFF Schools programs from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the film texts to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCA, and to subjects such as English, EAL, Literature, Media Studies, and to the Film Study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those courses, there is this key focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to critically engage with media texts across a range of contexts. And this is obviously a key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. And so for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not necessarily as a replacement or a substitute for the focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those elements. While the MIFF Schools program is ideally suited to students within French, Japanese, Mandarin, Spanish, and German language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a diverse range of subjects, abilities, and age groups, preparing students for text-based assessments and really developing those visual literacy skills. And so given the importance of visual literacy across a range of subjects, I'd recommend that prior to attending the screening, that teachers introduce or revise some key terminology and film techniques to outline the elements of the text that students should be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce the need for students to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining, films are fun, but there's also an expectation that they'll be analysing those films, whether as part of a non-English language course or English, EAL, Media or Film Studies unit. I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in more detail shortly, but a general overview of film techniques would be beneficial prior to the screening. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can assist in that process, whether on YouTube or in textbook form. But I would also emphasize from the outset that it's crucially important that students can first identify the technique, secondly, that they can understand its general function in creating meaning within the film, and thirdly, that they can apply that knowledge and that terminology to an analysis of the specific text in the context of the narrative, the characters, the themes and ideas that the film is exploring. And it's really difficult to achieve that final outcome unless the first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so with that in mind, some of the basic techniques and terminology that students should ideally be familiar with are things like cinematography, so the use, for example, of a close-up shot or a wide-angle shot, or camera movement, the various components of mise-en-scène, so basically everything that goes within the frame, the use of props, costumes, lighting, the blocking of actors, the composition of the frame, where relevant, things like music and lyrics, sound, dialogue, voiceover, the use of editing, narrative structure, the story elements within the narrative, and to things like visual motifs and symbolism. So as I mentioned, these basic building blocks of film language are really essential to establish pre-screening. And by setting these up prior to the screening, you're giving the students something to be on the lookout for while they're watching the film, rather than trying to work backwards after the screening, which is almost always less effective. And so depending on the age group or the academic level of the students, you could always assign individual students or groups of students with a particular technique or element of the film to be on the lookout for, to report back in the post-screening classroom discussion, so that they're not necessarily overwhelmed in attempting to look for everything all at once, especially if these are students who might not have a lot of experience with film analysis. Okay, so let's move on to looking at the film in more detail now. I should mention that this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid as much as possible giving away any crucial plot details or revelations within the film, while still providing an overview of aspects for analysis that might help structure classroom discussion. Normal is a French language coming-of-age film about a 14-year-old girl, Lucy, who is attempting to balance school life with part-time work and the responsibility of caring for her oddball father, William, who has multiple sclerosis. And their world is thrown into turmoil when a social worker is called on to assess their living situation, and the pair must attempt to present a vision of a quote-unquote normal household. So the film, which was directed by Olivier Babinet, has a really distinct visual and oral style, balancing these elements of social realism with these flourishes of fantasy to create quite a compelling and empathetic portrait of the challenges of caring for a parent with a disability or an illness, especially for someone at still such a young age. Okay, so just as an overview, some of the key themes and ideas that are explored within Normal include coming of age, themes of family, of disability. The film very clearly, given the title, asks the question, what is normal? The film deals with ideas of fantasy and imagination, of independence, questions of responsibilities. Again, a number of these themes and ideas are clearly interwoven or interlinked. Seeing and hiding, mortality, and the theme of performance or appearances more generally. And I'll touch on some of these in more detail throughout the presentation. When I approach a film text with a class, I often like to start with the big picture and then gradually work in towards the detailed scenic or filmic analysis. And one of the reasons I do that is to really emphasize the point for students that art and cinema isn't created in a vacuum. Cinema responds to its own cultural and historical moment, whether intentionally or unconsciously. And so placing a film within its own context is often a really useful starting point to helping students understand the text on a deeper level or deeper levels. And this film explores a range of social and cultural issues regarding teenhood, family, disability, and the specific geography in which this film takes place, in Chelles, in France, 18 kilometers outside the center of Paris. So that might be one context that you could pursue further in that classroom context, to give students a more acute understanding of the setting and the lives of these characters. Another would be to look at multiple sclerosis. Lucy's father suffers from this illness. If students aren't familiar with MS, then that would certainly be another context that you could pursue in class to really bolster the students' understanding of what her father is going through and what Lucy is going through. And certainly one other context here would be to look at the impacts of disability, certainly from the perspective of teenage children caring for a disabled parent. And again, I've listed a link to a possible article that you could introduce within that classroom context. The other context I think that this film lends itself to is one of adaptation. So the film was actually adapted from a stage play, The Monster in the Hall, by the Scottish playwright David Gregg, which was first performed back in 2010. The play is actually available as well, so you could use Normal as a sort of a comparative text in that framework. Another context that I think is really useful is one of production background. And here, I think interviews with the director might really enhance the students' understanding of the creative process and the creative intentions behind the film. Now, I often introduce that with the disclaimer that a writer or a director's intentions isn't the only way in which students can understand the film. There's no one definitive interpretation, but having an understanding or having an awareness of what the director intended for the film does open the film up to broader discussions and conversations. Did the students interpret the film the way the director intended? does having an awareness of the director's intentions shape our interpretation of the film? In what ways? There are a handful of interviews with the director, Olivier Babinets, online available. I've listed a couple of them there and an excerpt from one which I'll read from in just a moment. Both of those interviews I've listed are in French. So certainly for French language classes, you could use those interviews for translation exercises, but for non-French language speakers, those interviews are readily and easily translatable online. So this one quote from that Cameo Nancy.fr website. Babinets says, "I like a film to open doors to other worlds, without necessarily refraining from being realistic. As a spectator, I find that notions of fantasy and naturalism are not incompatible. My production designer even pushed me to rewatch fantastic films that I really like, including Donnie Darko, and especially It Follows, because they immerse very contemporary youth in suburban imagery that goes back in time. The contrast produced takes the film towards the fable, while maintaining a great credibility which is due to the actors, their physique, the proximity maintained with them. We had this in mind." So there you have an interesting perspective in terms of the film's tonal qualities and its approach regarding its historical setting and these elements of the fantastic, the fable, and the interrelationship between those elements, those tonal elements within the film, realism and fantasy as well. And again, I think reading that certainly opens the film up to more interpretations and a greater understanding of what this film is setting out to achieve. Another context through which you could look at this film is through genre. So the coming-of-age film. Normal can be approached through the lens of genre of the teen coming-of-age film, and also narratives dealing with family conflicts from that adolescent or teen perspective. The film also incorporates nods to other genres, such as horror cinema, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So coming-of-age films typically focus on this key transitional moment within adolescence or teenhood. And there you could ask the students to consider what films or TV shows that they've seen that deal with a coming of age. What are some points of connection between Lucy's story within this film and other coming of age narratives? So really trying to connect the students' experience of this film with their own viewing habits and the kinds of films and TV shows that they might be familiar, to really tease out the way in which genres repeat various story elements. How might this film differ from or subvert some of the traditional tropes of the coming-of-age narrative? And again, I think you could link that back to, say, the previous slide and Babinets' commentary about the film's tonal qualities, realism and fantasy. And just on this, some similar or relevant films that you could certainly draw on, a film like Swagger, which was a documentary directed by Olivier Babinets that was part of the MIFF Schools program back in 2017. A really great documentary focusing on Parisian youth in sort of lower socioeconomic region on the outskirts of Paris. Really, really great documentary that if you can get your hands on, certainly might provide, points of comparison in the classroom context. Or a film like Alemania, screening as part of this year's MIFF Schools program, a Spanish language film set in Argentina. Or some American examples. More recent, a film like Wildflower from 2022, or going back a few years now, What's Eating Gilbert Grape from 1993, a film that has those echoes in terms of children and disability and youth and coming of age that we see within that film. Okay, so moving on to the nuts and bolts of film analysis, with a closer look at the kinds of terminology and techniques that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And this is, again, really where students should be able to identify the technique, have a general understanding of its function within the language of cinema and filmmaking, but also then be able to apply that knowledge to the specific scene or shot or sequence or context in which those techniques are being used within the film. So, for example, a close-up shot used to foster intimacy between the audience and the character, to draw us into the emotional space of a character, like we see here in the character of Lucy, this sort of key moment that she's having with her classmate Etienne, who she also has a crush on. So this is sort of an intimate moment. The close-up reinforces the intimacy of this moment. By contrast, the wide-angle shot, which are often used to emphasize setting or position the character within their world, we have Lucy coming into her classroom, no one else is there. So the wide-angle shot highlights her sense of isolation, her sense of being an outsider within the classroom context. Also, the use of high and low angles. that are often used to determine a character's status within the film. So a high angle shot where the camera films a subject from above, looking down on them, tends to diminish their status, their power, their sense of self-worth potentially, which you could argue is perhaps relevant in this particular context when the social worker is arriving to assess her and her father. Now, normally we would say a low angle shot where the camera films a subject from below tends to exaggerate that character's status, increase their stature within the film. But here you could argue that it's being used to a different effect. And this is where having an awareness of context and students being flexible in terms of their understanding of terminology is really important. Because here I think the low angle shot, rather than emphasizing Lucy's power within this particular scene, actually highlights the fact that the world is sort of closed in around her. So the use of lighting, the use of composition with the window frame, which I'll come back to in a moment, these are all other key details that students should be mindful of when they're applying that understanding of film techniques. And there are a number of other techniques that students should be mindful of as well. So things like focus. So the way in which Lucy in the foreground is in focus, her father in the background is out of focus. Really using camera focus to provide a contrast between these two characters, maybe to suggest the kind of conflict or the disparity between these two figures. Or something like the use of a long take, where the camera sits unbroken and moves into this space, this conversation between father and daughter. In a way, not editing or cutting away from that moment, really draws the audience in to the scene in question. So again, having an awareness of editing or the use of long takes is important in certain contexts. The use of lighting, for example. Here we have a moment early on within the film, the use of sun, the use of natural lighting. Lucy's listening to music, she's in her own world. The use of lighting in this moment contrasts to how she's often seen at other points of the film, where there's low-level lighting, often within the space of her home or home life. The film also uses techniques like point of view, where the camera adopts Lucy's perspective. Again, another way in which the film positions the audience or aligns the audience with her perspective, reinforcing that identification between spectator and main character. The use of voiceover is another one. And also costume. Here we have an image of Lucy dressed in a unicorn onesie or unicorn jacket. Again, what does that tell us about her character? She has this vivid imagination. It reinforces both her youth and that space of imagination. And again, the use of lighting and shadow in that context provides a sort of contrast between the two worlds that she's trying to reconcile or negotiate. The world of adolescence and this very adult world in which she's taken on all these responsibilities. So composition is obviously a key one. And in this film, students should really be mindful of how Babinet uses various angles and compositions and how those contribute to our understanding of character and to themes within the film. So how is Lucy or the other characters, such as her father or Eddie-Anne, framed throughout the film? What does this reveal to us about the characters' emotional states or predicaments? And if you look at the selection of screenshots here, you'll notice the way in which the director uses a variety of compositional approaches to emphasize Lucy's outsider status or her sense of imprisonment or isolation, positioning her at the far left or right-hand side of frame. The filmmaker also positions her behind things like wire fences or the bars of the stairs, or through window frames and bars as well, both from an exterior or an interior perspective, and at school, or the same with her father. The use of a door frame within the frame. The world is sort of closing in on these characters. So again, it's about encouraging students to look to the visual language of the film, to see how meaning is created through these techniques, rather than relying just on dialogue alone for meaning. And this is where mise-en-scène is a really fundamental concept for film analysis. So asking students, how does the filmmaker utilize the various components of the visual design, lighting, composition, and the production elements such as props or costumes, some of which I've already referred to in isolation, to explore or convey these aspects related to themes or character? How are the various spaces within the film constructed visually or contrasted to other spaces or settings within the film? So you could look at, say, the mise-en-scène of her home, the kinds of chaos and junk that the characters seem to be surrounded in, or the particular lighting that the director's using here, the use of lighting and shadow. What does that tell us just from a visual perspective about the lives of these characters? Again, what does Lucy's bedroom tell us about her character? And again, there are some interesting components within the mise-en-scène of her bedroom. The wall of masks on one side, the poster of Edward Scissorhands on another, that lends the film that fable quality that Babinet referred to earlier in that excerpt from the interview. The different lighting, the blue lighting, the warm lighting, sort of the pink colours as well. How are they picked up on elsewhere within the film, such as the party scene or sequence that she attends with Edion. Again, how does the particular choice of blue lighting shape or influence how we understand or interpret that scene, just purely at a visual level? Music is another really key element within this film. So thinking about questions like, how does the film's soundtrack situate the film in or out of its historical and cultural setting? Babinet has talked about the ambiguity of when this film might be set and the deliberate approach in doing that. And certainly music and the use of music reinforces that sense to a degree. But also, what is Lucy's connection to music? How does music shape our understanding of certain scenes, just from an emotional perspective? And how might the lyrics of the music also contribute meaning to the film's various themes? So early on within the film, we hear the song Dolce Vita by Ryan Paris. I've provided an excerpt of those lyrics right there. And again, there's a sort of an irony in which this song is being used perhaps at the sense, this contrast between the music and this idea of Dolce Vita, the sort of the sweet life contrasted with the sort of social reality and of her home life and the difficulties that she's going through in her own personal life. And if you wanted to explore the soundtrack in more depth in that classroom follow-up, the soundtrack is available to listen to online on YouTube. So that would be something that you could introduce in that classroom context, just to come back to the way that music influences our interpretations of the film. So one of the key themes throughout this film is family. And students, I think, should really consider the significance of the film's title in relation to this theme and to definitions of the family, of family roles, family responsibilities. What does it mean to be normal, either as a family or as an individual? And also, in what ways is Lucy's home life shown to be both positively and negatively impactful? Because the film does provide contrast here, and I think that's really worth keeping in mind, that we have this portrait of a very, loving father-daughter relationship, but on the flip side, you have a portrait of a teenager who's taking on responsibilities sort of well beyond her years. And there's an interesting moment early on within the film where she's given a pamphlet, I think it's from a Jehovah's Witness, potentially, with the translated title, The Secret of Family Happiness. And again, there's sort of an ironic contrast here between Lucy's home life and the one that's presented on this pamphlet, linking this back to ideas of what is normal, what defines, say, family happiness in this context. As you may have gathered from that earlier Babinet quote, the film shifts between reality and Lucy's fantasy version of the world, or through the lens of her imagination. So how are these two modes of seeing the world connected? What is the significance of the opening shot of the film, which is a close-up on Lucy's locked journal? So the film is framed almost in that sort of fable storytelling trope of the book opening and then we enter the story world. So in what ways is Lucy's writing or her imagination really crucial to, say, the film's resolution and to notions about the value or the function of storytelling in our day-to-day lives? We see excerpts from Lucy's journal at various points. In one case, she's writing, Lucy isn't like normal people. But also we see a scene where her father says, want me to tell you a story. So storytelling works not just from her perspective, but from the father as well. So the film is as much about storytelling as it is telling a story in some ways, I think. So following on from that, the motif of movies, TV, and video games. What role do TV, films, and video games play throughout the film for characters like Lucy and her father? Does cinema offer audiences a form of escapism that allows us to indirectly confront the horrors of the real world and to come to terms with them? In what ways does Lucy's viewing of horror go beyond the role of spectator? And again, I think you could refer back to Babinet's take on this, where he says, the relationship echoes what I know as an adult and a parent, and at the same time is very close to what I knew with my own father. The westerns we saw with him were a party. He would get in the mood with a whiskey and talking like John Wayne, me by dressing up, setting up a little saloon or a gambling den at home. We would go beyond the role of spectators. My father died early in the preparation of Normal, and I believe that his way of communicating with me through the imagination came to permeate the film. I love that expression, going beyond the role of spectators. And here I think we get a sense of that because these rituals that Lucy and her father have of watching horror films or horror video games or of television go beyond their role of spectators. It emphasizes their heightened significance for these characters in the context of the narrative and throughout the film. In terms of motifs and visual motifs that we see throughout the film, one of the more present ones is that of death. So what do these images of death, or these motifs of death, tell us about Lucy's mental health, or the kinds of thoughts that she's attempting to process? Are they a sign of past grief or trauma, or are they an attempt to prepare herself for what may happen in the future, or perhaps both? And again, we see these images throughout the film in a variety of ways, both through sort of hand drawings, through these imaginative flares where, death skulls are projected on people's faces, through imagery on television or in the walls, or through more direct, grounded references to death, such as through the cemetery. There's also the recurring motif of eyes and masks throughout the film. So how does their deeper meanings or significance reveal themselves over the course of the narrative? How might we understand the connected or associated ideas to those motifs of seeing or performing or of hiding, this idea of being masked in relation to the various characters? So there is this focus or this emphasis on eyes and masks throughout the film, in which the meanings associated with those motifs tends to reveal themselves gradually over the course of the narrative. Those meanings change and take different forms and different shapes. But it's there in the dialogue as well, as we hear Etienne say at one point, although translated, I have an eye for detail. Again, the reference back to the eye and its significance. So to the theme of performance. So how does the theme of performance, which is very much tied to the school production within the narrative, also connects to some of the broader themes and ideas within the film? In what ways might we understand the various characters as performing, not just on stage, but in their daily lives? Again, these ideas could all be brought back to the question of, what is normal? Certainly that's something prompted in the dialogue of the film, such as when Etienne says, appearances matter to social workers. Putting on a performance, putting on appearances. And without giving anything away about the ending of the film, students should really consider the kind of creative choices regarding the ending and the concluding imagery of the film. So things like, what impression might the director be attempting to leave us with? What does the ending suggest about Lucy's future? Does the ending point away to the resolution of her character's conflicts, or are ambiguities allowed to persist? Why might the director have chosen to end the film with a direct-to-camera look? Almost breaking that fourth wall, quite deliberately, I would argue, where, as an audience now, we meet her gaze. So what are the ramifications of that? And here I would really encourage students to come up with a range of interpretations, to really drum into them the idea that there is no one correct way of interpreting a film. And so in terms of bringing all of these elements together in the form of a potential assessment, I think students could be encouraged to read and critically engage with published reviews of the film, and then respond by writing their own, whether in French or in English, drawing on their close analysis of the film and utilizing the kinds of terminology that I've outlined throughout this presentation. So one example of a review published on this film, which I've translated from Italian, by Sarah Mataloni, and she writes, built in a fantasy key halfway between the lightness of Amelie and a passionate and melancholic coming of age, seasoned with rock and pop music, Normal has the ability to drag the viewer's gaze into a complicated and potentially devastating human story, which becomes, thanks to a continuous change of perspective and a mix of genres, fun, full of ideas, and at times touching. Thus, a story of desperation, malaise, shame, and humiliation, of which the protagonist's diary warns us in its incipit, becomes an interesting reality that continually changes face, thanks to the dreamy, passionate, and delicate gaze of the protagonist. Thanks to a well-calibrated rhythm, the use of brilliant dialogue, and original but overall credible characters, Babinets manages to effectively outline an adolescent family drama without exasperating the viewer with excessive sentimentality, and, at the same time, avoiding falling into the trap of easy tears. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, just head on over to miff.com.au/schools, and you will find all the information and resources, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and MIFF Schools programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very pleasurable and educationally productive viewing at this year's festival. Thanks so much.